The year was 1914. The world stood on the brink of war. But that morning, passengers aboard a grand ocean liner had no idea they would face a terror far more immediate than any battlefield. 14 minutes, that's all it took. 14 minutes for one of history's deadliest maritime disasters to unfold. Yet today, almost no one remembers this tragedy. They remember the Titanic. It sank 2 years earlier, with great fanfare and endless coverage. But this disaster? It was as if the fog that claimed the ship also erased it from history's memory. Picture this. You're asleep in your cabin. It's just past 2 a.m. on a calm night. You've booked passage on what was considered one of the safest ships of its time, one of the most luxurious. The vessel has made this journey hundreds of times without incident. You drift off to sleep, lulled by the gentle motion of the ship cutting through still waters. Then, in an instant, your world turns upside down, literally. The ship lurches violently to one side. Books, furniture, people, everything slides across the floor. Water rushes in through portholes, now below the waterline. In the darkness, you hear screaming, confusion, the haunting groan of metal under extreme strain. What happened next would shock investigators. It would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. And it would raise questions unanswered for more than a century. Because this ship didn't just sink. It was swallowed by the river so quickly many passengers never even made it out of their beds. But here's the disturbing part. This tragedy was entirely preventable. And the reason it happened will make you question everything. Everything you think you know about maritime safety, about human judgment, about the deadly consequences of overconfidence. Official records tell us 1,012 lives were lost that night, more than many famous tragedies. Yet this disaster slipped from public memory while others became legend. Was it because the victims were mostly immigrants seeking better lives? Was it because World War I began just weeks later, overshadowing everything else? Or was there something more deliberate about how this story disappeared from history's memory? Tonight, we uncover the dark truth, the fog, the collision, the 14 minutes that changed everything. You'll hear from survivors whose accounts were buried in archives for decades, and you'll see why some maritime disasters become legendary while others are forgotten. The question isn't just what happened that night. The question is, why don't you already know? To understand what happened that night, we need to travel back to 1914. This was a time when crossing the Atlantic was the height of luxury and adventure. The Royal Empress was called a floating palace, built in Scotland, launched in 1906. She was 548 feet long, able to carry nearly 1,600 passengers across the ocean in style. Her first-class dining room rivaled the finest hotels in London and Paris. The ship boasted electric lighting, steam heating, even a dark room for photography enthusiasts. Our story begins in late May 1914, in the bustling port of Liverpool, England. The Royal Empress was preparing for what should have been a routine voyage. Destination, Quebec City, Canada. These transatlantic runs were the lifeline connecting the old world to the new. They carried immigrants seeking better lives, businessmen pursuing opportunities, and wealthy travelers on vacation. Captain Henry Richardson was a seasoned mariner, over 30 years of experience at sea. He had commanded the Royal Empress for 4 years without a single major incident. Passengers trusted him implicitly. The crew described him as cautious but confident, never one to take unnecessary risks. The passenger list read like a cross-section of early 20th century society. In first class, wealthy industrialists and their families. In second class, skilled workers, teachers, small business owners, and in third class, hundreds of working-class immigrants. They carried everything they owned in battered suitcases and cloth bundles. Among the passengers was a large Salvation Army band. Most of its members would never make it home. There were newlyweds on honeymoon, children traveling alone to join their parents, and elderly couples making their final journey to family in Canada. The ship departed Liverpool on June 28, 1914. Conditions were perfect, the weather was clear, spirits were high. For 5 days, the journey was everything passengers had hoped for. The food was excellent, the entertainment lively. The ship's orchestra played each evening in the Grand Salon. By the evening of June 2nd, the Royal Empress was in the St. Lawrence River, approaching her destination, just hours from Quebec City. Passengers packed their belongings. Children pressed their faces to the portholes, hoping to catch their first glimpse of the new world. The crew prepared for another successful crossing. But the St. Lawrence in 1914 was a busy waterway. Passenger liners, cargo vessels, fishing boats, coastal steamers all moved through the river at night. Communication relied entirely on lights, horns, and whistle blasts. There was no radio coordination as we know it today. As evening fell, a thick fog began to roll in from the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Fog was not unusual for this area. Warm and cold waters mixed here often, but this fog was different. Passengers described it as unusually dense, a wall of gray that seemed to erase everything ahead. Captain Richardson was aware, of course. He reduced speed, he ordered extra lookouts. The ship's horn sounded at regular intervals, following standard procedure. Everything seemed under control. But hidden somewhere in that fog, another ship was approaching, on a collision course. What happened next would change maritime safety forever. As the Royal Empress moved through the thickening fog, passengers were settling in for their final evening on board. Most had already retired to their cabins, exhausted from the long journey, excited about reaching Quebec City the next morning. In the pilot house, Captain Richardson studied the fog with concern. Officers of that era had only their experience and intuition. No radar, no modern navigation equipment, just compass readings, charts, and dead reckoning. The fog was unlike anything Richardson had seen in 30 years at sea. It felt heavy, pressing against the windows like a living wall. Visibility dropped to only a few yards. The ship's searchlights, built to illuminate objects far ahead, barely pierced the gray surrounding them. What passengers didn't know was this. The crew was receiving conflicting information about their exact position. The navigator, Harold Stevens, kept taking readings, but without landmarks, the river's channels became uncertain. They knew Quebec City was close, but exactly how close? No one could say. At about 1:30 a.m., the night watch grew uneasy. Several crewmen reported hearing horn blasts in the distance, signals from another vessel. This was common in the St. Lawrence, but these blasts seemed closer, and in the fog, no one could determine direction. First Officer William Morrison made his rounds on deck. What he noticed chilled him. The fog was playing tricks with sound. Horns seemed to come from starboard, then suddenly from port. The distortion was so complete, even seasoned sailors felt disoriented. In the radio room, operator Thomas Clark monitored the wireless. He heard routine messages, cargo ships reporting positions, a passenger steamer announcing arrival in Montreal, fishing boats coordinating work. Everything sounded normal, yet Clark couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. In first class, a young woman named Margaret Thompson remained awake. She was writing in her diary. Later she would recall that the ship's motion felt different, not rough, but hesitant, as if the vessel itself was groping through the dark. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Robert MacDonald maintained reduced speed. The Empress usually ran at 18 knots. Tonight, they were moving at half that. MacDonald understood. Fog on the St. Lawrence could turn deadly in an instant. Meanwhile, miles away, another vessel faced the same conditions. The cargo collier Nordic Star. 14,000 tons of coal from Nova Scotia filled her holds. She was bound for Montreal under Captain Eric Anderson. The Nordic Star was no passenger ship. It was built for work, not luxury. Her crew of 37 knew these waters well, but they too were flying blind. Reduced speed, horn blasts at intervals, caution layered over every movement. Here's the chilling truth. Both ships were in the proper lanes. Both were taking precautions. Both captains were experienced. But the fog created what investigators later called a perfect storm of confusion and miscommunication. The first sign of imminent danger came at 1:55 a.m. Lookout James Patterson spotted a faint glow. Running lights in the fog. He immediately reported to the bridge. Captain Richardson ordered 3 long blasts of the ship's whistle, the international signal for "I am backing engines." But the fog betrayed them. Sound warped and shifted. The crew of the Nordic Star heard the signal, but judged it to be farther away than it was. Captain Anderson ordered his ship to maintain course. From that moment, the outcome was sealed. 2 vessels, each believing they were acting correctly, continued straight toward one another, hidden by the fog, bound together by fate. At 2:09 a.m., lookouts on both ships finally saw the other, a wall of steel emerging from the gray. But by then, it was far too late. At 2:09 a.m., June 3, 1914, Lookout Patterson on the Royal Empress shouted the words every sailor dreads. "Ship bearing down on the starboard bow." Captain Richardson rushed to the starboard wing of the bridge. Through a brief gap in the fog, he saw it, the Nordic Star, a massive wall of steel, her bow aimed directly at the Empress's side. "Hard to port! Full astern!" Richardson cried. But momentum is merciless. The Empress weighed over 14,000 tons. Even at reduced speed, she could not stop in time. The rudder turned, engines reversed, but it was like trying to shift a mountain. On the Nordic Star, Captain Anderson faced the same terror. His ship was heavily loaded with coal, even less maneuverable. He shouted his own orders, "Full astern! Sound the general alarm!" For 30 seconds, both crews watched in horror, the gap closing, time slowing. Passengers who were awake heard the sudden chaos, alarms, voices shouting, engines grinding in reverse. In the first-class lounge, Margaret Thompson wrote in her diary. Later she recalled, "The ship seemed to hold its breath. Then came the most awful sound, as if the very hull was tearing apart." At 2:10 a.m., the collision came. The Nordic Star's reinforced bow struck amidships. The impact thundered across the river, steel twisting, water rushing, a wound torn deep below the waterline. The Empress heeled sharply to starboard. Water poured through open portholes now below the surface. Cabins flooded within minutes. Passengers were thrown from their beds. Confusion and fear spread in the darkness. In third class, chaos reigned. Corridors filled with water. Families separated in the rush. Many could not even find the exits as the ship tilted. Chief Officer Morrison tried to organize evacuation, but the lifeboats were nearly useless. On the port side, they hung too far from the ship. On the starboard side, they were pressed against the hull. In the wireless room, Operator Clark tapped out distress signals. SOS, SOS, Royal Empress collision, St. Lawrence River, immediate assistance required. But as water reached the generators, power flickered. Soon, the radio fell silent. Dr. James Grant, the ship's physician, moved through the listing corridors. He realized the truth. The ship was not only sinking, she was rolling, the angle worsening by the minute. Above deck, fear turned to panic. Some passengers clung to railings, others prayed aloud. The ship's band assembled, playing hymns to calm the crowd. They chose Nearer, My God, to Thee, a song already linked to another great tragedy 2 years earlier. 15-year-old Emma Collins remembered, "The floor became the wall, and the wall became the ceiling. My mother held my hand. Then the water came, and suddenly she was gone." On the Nordic Star, Captain Anderson's crew lowered lifeboats. They threw life preservers into the fog. But voices calling for help echoed strangely, sound bouncing, shifting. Rescuers struggled to find those in need. By 2:20 a.m., Captain Richardson knew the end was near. He gave the order no captain ever wishes to give: abandon ship. But it was too late. The list was so severe, launching boats was nearly impossible. Passengers faced the unthinkable choice: jump into freezing water in total darkness, or remain aboard a doomed vessel. At 2:24 a.m., just 14 minutes after the collision, the Royal Empress gave a final violent lurch. Then she slipped beneath the waters of the St. Lawrence River. Hundreds were thrown into the icy darkness. The cries for help carried across the fog. But the water was so cold, most could survive only minutes. Many lifeboats passed within yards of survivors without ever seeing them. The great liner that had carried thousands safely across the Atlantic was gone in less than a quarter of an hour. Now only one question remained: how many of the 1,367 souls on board would survive the night? Rescue efforts that night were hindered by the same fog that caused the disaster. Ships converged from every direction: cargo vessels, fishing boats, even a Canadian naval destroyer. But the gray wall made it almost impossible to find survivors. The Nordic Star, though damaged, became the main rescue vessel. Captain Anderson ordered every available boat lowered. His crew blasted the horn continuously to guide people in the water. They worked through the night, pulling passengers from the freezing river, offering blankets, water, and first aid. The scenes were heartbreaking. Some survivors had been in the water for more than an hour. Many were weak from the cold. Some were unconscious. Others clung to life, delirious from shock. Families were separated. Children cried out for parents who would never answer. Spouses searched desperately for loved ones who were gone. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a first-class passenger who reached a lifeboat, later recalled, "The fog made it a nightmare. Voices called for help all around, but you could not see where they were coming from. And then the voices stopped." When dawn finally broke, the scale of the disaster was clear. 1,012 lives had been lost. Only 465 people survived. It was one of the deadliest maritime tragedies in history. What made it worse was how close they were to safety. The Empress went down only 120 miles from Quebec City. By morning, many had expected to be disembarking. Instead, families were grieving. The investigation revealed troubling details. Both ships had followed proper procedures, but the fog created conditions that overwhelmed those precautions. Neither captain was found criminally negligent, yet the inquiry demanded change. New fog protocols were established within months. Improved communication equipment was required on passenger ships. Crew training was overhauled. The hard lessons of that night reshaped maritime safety for decades. And there was resilience. Canadian communities rallied to support survivors. Churches and families opened their homes. Businesses gave clothing, food, and work. Emma Collins, the 15-year-old who lost her mother, was taken in by a Quebec family. They raised her as their own daughter. The Salvation Army, devastated by the loss of its entire staff band, rebuilt. Donations poured in from around the world. Within a year, a new band was formed. Their first performance was dedicated to those who had perished. Captain Richardson survived, but he never commanded another ship. He spent his remaining years working for maritime safety organizations. His testimony, his experience, helped train a new generation of officers. He carried the weight of that night until his death. Families of the victims created networks of support. For years they gathered for memorial services. Stories were told, names remembered. The grief became a bond that stretched across generations. The wreck of the Empress still lies in the St. Lawrence River, resting in 130 feet of water. Divers report that the grand staircase is still visible, silent, haunting, a reminder of the lives lost. In the end, 1,012 souls were gone, but their sacrifice led to changes that have saved thousands more since. More than a century later, questions remain. How could two experienced captains, following maritime rules, still collide? And how could it happen in one of the world's busiest waterways? Historians point to unusual atmospheric conditions, a rare temperature inversion over the St. Lawrence River. On that night, records show a strong temperature inversion. It created an unusually dense marine layer. In 1914, science could not fully explain it. Others point to human factors. Shipping companies faced heavy pressure to keep schedules. Even if Captain Richardson was cautious, the pressure was always there. Survivors gave conflicting accounts. Some remembered hearing extra horn blasts. Others swore they saw strange lights in the fog. Most likely, these were stress-altered memories. In moments of terror, human recall is rarely perfect. The inquiry dismissed conspiracy theories. It found no deliberate wrongdoing. Yet, it confirmed that communication methods were outdated. The tragedy proved the urgent need for better systems. What remains clear is the legacy: stronger safety rules, improved signaling, training that has protected countless lives since. The exact truth of those final minutes may remain hidden, but the lessons continue to guide every ship that sails today. The Royal Empress disaster reminds us that tragedy can strike without warning, even when everyone follows the rules. It was a convergence of fog, limited technology, and simple bad luck. A routine voyage became one of history's forgotten disasters. Today, ships have radar, GPS, and satellite communication. Collisions like this are nearly impossible. But the cost of that progress was over 1,000 lives. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not overshadowed by more famous tragedies. Their loss brought safety changes that still save lives today. And that is their lasting legacy.